Today's video started off like a few of my other videos, trawling across eBay to see if I could find something misleading or sketchy. What I didn't expect to find was a rabbit hole of fake benchmarks and a web of dodgy accounts. So, this right here is the Radeon HD 4890, and you're probably thinking, oh no, why is he going to do one of these again? As we've already seen this card before in the early days of the channel, and recently when I threw some modded drivers onto it. And when I say recently, that was probably a couple of years ago now. Either way, it was just to demonstrate how poorly abandoned these cards were by AMD. Either way, that is not what this video is about. It's rather a bit of a different video actually, but anyway, a refresher on the specs. It's based on AMD's original Terascale architecture, complete with 1GB of GDDR5 based VRAM, higher clocks, which could hit 1GHz, 800 shading units, and eventually became AMD's flagship card. In fact, it was the first card to ever push that 1GHz barrier, which was all well and good back then 11 years ago when it came out in 2009, The problem is it's not 2009 anymore, and since then the card hasn't received driver updates in years, with the final revision of drivers having a reputation for being far less than stable in most modern use cases. Pair that with a lack of DirectX 11 and you end up with a card that is sort of just left flopping around pointlessly in 2020. It's still a decent retro card, I mean I've used them in XP builds before, but what exactly makes this a scam? It looks like we've just been sent a HD 4890 for a slightly higher than usual price. Well, that's where this gets more interesting, as I wasn't just going to purchase another one of these cards just to torture myself with some more Terascale benchmarks. See, it's a good thing I took a few screenshots of the original listing, as it's since been removed by the seller, and I'll touch more on that later on, as these benchmarks that it was being sold under are completely false, and we'll get around to testing that just to prove it in a bit, and get on to confronting the scammer later on in the video. In fact, a lot of the actual scam side of things we'll be getting onto later on in the video, but why don't we just pick it apart for a little bit here? What stands out to me mostly isn't things like Far Cry 3 and Crysis and Borderlands. No, I've tested things like that, and they do run okay with lower settings and lower resolutions on this card. The thing is, GTA 4 is optimised so bloody poorly that is not going to be seeing 60 FPS, as even my current system can't do that. CSGO might run close to those claimed figures, but that's well in excess of 100 FPS, and this is an old card nowadays, so what kind of settings are they running to actually get that playing at those frame rates? But remember how I was talking about how the card is limited to DirectX 10.1 and is just sort of abandoned? Well, how many of these games on this list are DirectX 11 only games? Watch Dogs, Far Cry 4, Crysis 3, maybe a few more on there, but it's pretty misleading when these games won't even launch. But before we dive any deeper into this scam, we need to find out just how accurate these benchmarks are, because there are plenty of games listed on here that will actually launch on the card, and I don't doubt a few that might actually run close to these games', claimed performance. I did actually message the seller and press him for the settings he used for these benchmarks, but at this stage I was given no response. He wouldn't even respond to me, and I sent a few messages asking what kind of settings I should be using to see these kinds of frame rates. All in all though, it just meant I had to spend the day benchmarking to get as close to these figures as possible to see if he was claiming the truth, because we don't know settings. I bought this under the premise of frame rates. We're going to be giving it the best chance possible though with a Ryzen 7 3700X CPU, which is, the best CPU I have on hand, and the latest stable drivers from AMD. As modded drivers were not playing nice with this card, they are very unstable as I touched on my other video, but they do offer a slight performance boost. But anyway, let's get right into it and find out what is going on with this weird Terascale card. Firstly, let's start on a positive note. I know for a fact that this card can run Far Cry 3 quite nicely, so with medium settings in 720p, we saw pretty close to the claimed average. We were only about 8 FPS behind generally from what they claimed, and that was like worst case scenario, and the game did look alright as well. I just wanted to get that out of the way as I'm pretty familiar with the card's performance before I end up with a load of people spamming me in the comments section saying, oh, those benchmarks are accurate. They're not. We'll be getting onto that in a minute. But either way, we could see some frame drops here or there in action, and it didn't matter what resolution or settings we used because this is a strange game and I can't make out whether it's optimized or unoptimized. But still, some games are going to run close to the claimed benchmarks because there must be some sort of degree of truth to them. Or maybe they just made them up and got lucky. I don't know. I knew this card would perform like this in this instance though. Next up though is where this gets a little bit more fun. See, GTA 4, which is meant to run at a claimed 85 FPS average, well, here is the game running with some fairly low settings in 800 by 600 and going much lower than this would actually cause GPU utilization to drop. So this is where I believe most of our issues are just with the fake benchmarks. Either way, we are entirely GPU bound here. This is not my Ryzen's fault in any way whatsoever, and we are nowhere near our target frame rate. Maybe inside buildings you could see close to the claimed average, but that was the only instance we could ever get it close to that. Maybe that and looking up at the sky. Either way, it was not exactly what I'd call a great experience, and if you up the settings to 720p, you could see a pretty playable experience with the game hovering between 30 to 40 FPS, which is actually decent in a game that is as poorly optimized as GTA 4 is. But either way, there is no way this card is ever going to run this game as well as they're claiming. All in all though, it just shows that these benchmarks are not going in a great direction. CSGO is a game that will generally run pretty okay on Terascale cards, but claiming above 100 FPS on average in 2020 is quite the reach, isn't it? However, with some time spent tweaking around with the settings, I did manage to get the game running pretty closely to the claimed FPS, and I just meant playing in the lowest settings in 640 by 480 with anything that could have a remotely negative impact on performance turned off, no matter how slight it had to be turned off. Genuinely, that's as much as I had to do to try and get it as close to these claimed figures. Really, the game looked awful. Trying to play it around the incredibly large spec readout was near enough impossible, but there you go. The game does actually hit the claimed FPS target some of the time. Higher detailed maps would of course cause frame rate drops beneath this. Didn't matter what you were doing with the card, it would just happen. And then of course you got the fact that the game runs absolutely fine in a HD resolution with higher settings. It just means you're not going to be seeing 100 FPS. But there you go, apparently we can hit 100 FPS on this card. You just won't actually be able to see what you're playing. Now, as I mentioned earlier when I was testing Far Cry, a lot of games will run fine. Borderlands will run absolutely fine, and despite running with around 5 to 10 FPS slower than the claimed figures, we were having a great time playing it in 720p with the medium preset. We were playing with an uncapped frame rate, but really I'd cap it down slightly just to get a slightly smoother experience. All in all though, one of the games I remember testing back a few years ago when I originally tested this card, and it still runs as well as it did back then. The same also goes for Crysis, which ran about as well as the benchmark stated in 720p with medium and high settings, although there could be some frame drops here or there when there was action going on, which would bring the average down. It did stick close to the claimed figure, but I wouldn't say his average was entirely correct on this one, as unless you were just walking through the jungle and not doing anything, you weren't going to be seeing the frame rate he was claiming. Not necessarily a misleading indicator when you compare it to the performance I actually achieved, and just how poor CSGO and GTA 4 was, but still, not ideal, and he was a little bit off on that one. Now at this stage I thought, okay, maybe the seller mixed up who he was selling this card for, maybe he didn't understand what he was selling, and he didn't actually have the right benchmarks on hand. Maybe it was all just a bit of a mix-up. Maybe, this is a bit of an innocent mistake. So I messaged the seller, and most likely out of fear, because he probably thought I was going to put in for a refund, I did actually get a response this time. I simply posed the question, "Hello, do you know why my card can't run some of these games all too well, and why it can't run Watch Dogs and some of the other games properly? I just get errors." To which I got the response, "My benchmarks and testing are all correct, look it up online, you will find solution." So I thought, right, he's claiming his benchmarks to be correct, they aren't correct at all, so we're going to have to challenge this because, I want to see if I can get my money back at this point. So, who here has heard of the DirectX control panel? Well, this lets you force your system to emulate DirectX features which are missing on your card, meaning you can technically launch programs you otherwise couldn't. So despite this being a DirectX 10 card, we can actually launch DirectX 11 games. It just means that we'll have to emulate those certain draw calls on our CPU. All it means, though, is that it's going to be bloody slow. And it was so bloody slow I had to film my screen, because I couldn't film it at all, because who would have thought actually emulating these draw calls was extremely slow. With slow, of course, being pretty much the meaning behind doing this, which is why I've ended up using it so many times in this paragraph. Either way, Watch Dogs was the only thing I needed to test to prove that nothing DirectX 11 based was going to be running on this graphics card. And it is worth noting that Crysis 3 does actually have a workaround where you can get a sort of buggy variant to launch using the DirectX 10 console version or something like that. But at that stage, we're modifying the game's files. I don't really want to re-download Crysis 3 just to test that, and that's not exactly what he's claiming here. He's claiming all these benchmarks are accurate, and I shouldn't have to be modifying game files to run games that are claimed to be running anyway. Now at this stage we've got a fairly good idea about these benchmarks. They are at worst completely false, just trying to flog off graphics cards that don't really sell for that much to people that don't understand cards, or what I was kind of hoping for, because it's the more moral route, someone that just listed the benchmarks wrong, which is where the rabbit hole started. So I messaged the seller with an upload of my benchmarks to a private channel, just claiming that I couldn't get the performance he was claiming in his benchmarks, the card was DirectX 10 only, and I couldn't play what I wanted to play, so I just wanted to know if he was misleading people. To this I got the response, "Benchmarks false, you make these up." I responded back with, "How can I make up the benchmarks? This is a DirectX 10 card, it can't run half the games you claim it can." To which he responded, "I know what I am sell. These cards are good for all games shown, no refunds are given as I have tested myself." To which I had to leave a claim with eBay as the seller wouldn't go on any further, in fact he wouldn't respond to me anymore. And this is where things get even deeper. See, I saw another graphics card being sold, just a HD 4830 from a different seller, but it had similar photos and the exact same benchmarks. Which of course are completely false, because that's even weaker than this card here. So I went to stick a lowball bid on it. And we'd already gone deep enough down the rabbit hole at this point that, just spending a couple more quid to find out what was going on was quite interesting to me. But I couldn't bid on it, because I'd been blocked by the seller, despite having no recollection of ever purchasing from them, or ever having been contacted by the seller. I'd been blocked from buying stuff from them. It was at this stage I did even more digging and found out how all this scam was working. So, let me break this all down for you. There seems to be 3 different sellers, all use the same benchmarks across a range of cards, all from relatively new eBay accounts with feedback solely from purchases, nothing from selling. Now, the cards they sell mostly seem to be the mid-range Terascale cards, which don't really tend to sell for very much over here on eBay UK, because frankly, their only main use is retro at this point. Most people are quite aware that they're not great for modern uses. But the complete list of graphics cards I managed to compile from what I could find that had sold was HD 4670s, 4770s, 4830s, 4870s, and the occasional 4890 like the ones I purchased today. The other 2 sellers seem to stick to mostly the same tier of cards, but from the older generation, the HD 3000 series, with a few 3450s thrown in there as well on the lower end, because those are quite common as well, still claiming the same benchmarks on something that low end. But I was blocked from all 3 sellers though. I was unable to contact or bid on any other items. Most seem to be sold on auction, however a few would buy it now, and they all seem to be available for slightly above market value. Not much above market value, but still above market value. And all of them had the same fake benchmarks. But where are these benchmarks from? Well, while working on this video, and one of the reasons why I extended it is I found a listing for a HD 5830. That had been recently relisted due to a time waster, and it seemed to feature the exact same benchmarks again. That's right, this is all getting very strange. So I got in contact with the seller, who seemed to have a decently reputable eBay account, to ask where he got these benchmarks from. And he claimed that he did all the benchmarks himself, and he did exaggerate slightly in some places by using lowered settings, but the card had a low buy it now price, and really he just wanted the card gone. And it seemed fair enough, his story lined up, and he didn't have any knowledge of these benchmarks actually having been stolen and being passed off as performance figures for older Terascale cards. So where do we go from here? Well, I myself have put in for a refund. All 3 sellers have been reported, as I've got in contact with eBay, both via emails and actually on the phone to explain the situation as well as possible, and the listings have been taken down, and eBay is allegedly investigating the misleading trio. Just makes me wish I'd taken more screenshots of the listing, as those have all been taken down. However, for now, keep your eyes out, as you never know if these people will be back trying to make more money off these old cards. In fact, I'm beginning to just think this is just stupid, just to make a couple of quid extra. They're willing to scam people. rather than just selling these cards for what they are. Yes, they probably fly off the shelves quicker with fake benchmarks, but still, it's just ridiculous. All in all, I'll leave a pinned comment with updates if the accounts are taken down, if I get my money back and all that. I think I spent probably about 17 quid all in all in this card, which is a rip-off for a 4890 over here. I've picked up these cards for less than a fiver, even a pound once. Really though, I should be able to get it back hopefully with PayPal and all that there. And all in all, to sum it up for you guys, it turns out it was just a trio of scammers trying to flog off older graphics cards with fake benchmarks they'd nicked off a legitimate seller and blocking anyone who called them out or asked for a refund. All in all, taken down for now, so stay safe out there. I hope you enjoyed this little escapade. It took me a little while to figure out all the ins and outs and how to throw this all together. Good night. So, there we go. I've gone scam hunting again. People seem to like it when I do, this time much closer to home, and a much less common scam. This is more just trying to mislead people with false advertising. Still, not okay in my books, and I'm glad we've done something about it. If you'd like to see more, you can always like and subscribe for that.